What comes to mind when you hear the term data ethics? For me, it's something esoteric and amorphous. I understand what it means to be ethical, but how can data be ethical? I read a lot about live facial recognition, and the word ethics comes up a lot. Is it ethical to scan someone's face without their permission? How does it link to privacy? It's a bit of a minefield. Police Scotland has an entire team devoted to data ethics. In fact, they were the first force in the UK to have a data ethics team. I'm Levin, editor of Emergency Services Times. And in this episode of For Every Response, I talked to Corinne Russell, the data ethics lead for Police Scotland. For this short series of the pod, we are all about tech perspectives with our partners, the Emergency Tech Show and the Police Digital Service. Corinne tells me, I love working in data ethics. I find it so interesting and rewarding. It's a pleasure to talk to Corinne about her work and soon discover that Police Scotland has a mature approach to data and strong leadership in this area. She explains how they assess the ethics of technology used by the force. And I'm pleased we get to touch on live facial recognition and get an update on the force's thinking on introducing this in Scotland. We kick off this conversation by finding out how she started her career in Police Scotland.
I have worked for Police Scotland since I finished university, pretty much. For most of my kind of early career, I worked as a criminal intelligence analyst, mainly in our major investigations teams. So doing that role, I really learned a lot about the value of data in policing and how it contributes to operational decision making. I then spent a couple of years as a cyber threat intelligence analyst in the financial sector. So through that, I gained experience in cyber and information security, which then allowed me to come back to Police Scotland in a new role within data protection. So that's where I was when our data ethics function was first set up. So it was sort of a natural move into an area that I was interested in and also had the relevant skills and background for. And it's been great. I love working in data ethics. I find it so interesting and rewarding.
Is it unusual for a police force to have someone working in data ethics? Are there many of you? How does it work organisationally?
There aren't many of us at the moment, no. So Police Scotland was actually the first force in the UK to have its own data ethics function and data ethics framework. So we were the first data ethics lead, essentially. And there are a few of us now that I sort of meet up with on a regular basis, and the group is growing. But because data ethics is still quite a new area, there just aren't that many of us yet. So it's good to share, what we've encountered so far.
And in terms of data ethics, would expect that perhaps to come from the technology department. But where does it sit in Police Scotland? And what was the leadership that meant that your force became the first one to have data ethics? That sounds like it's coming from the top. Or was it where who are we looking at in terms of your organisation? Who's the leader here?
Yeah, I suppose it was really part of the establishment of our Chief Data Office generally. So I'm based within the Chief Data Office, and that covers, we have a data science team, we obviously have data ethics, and we have data governance and information assurance as well, which is data protection, information security, all comes under the Chief Data Office. So the reason that was all established was essentially back in 2020 when we drew up our joint strategy for policing. And in that strategy, we set out a lot of ambitions to become a very data-driven organisation. And a huge part of that was the ethical considerations around how we do that, how we innovate responsibly. And it was identified that we needed a bespoke data ethics team, basically.
So when we think about data ethics, I think it would be useful just to start with some examples. So in the work that you've been doing since setting up that function in 2020, very sort of early doors, very innovative at the time. What have you done since then that people could understand as, that makes sense, I understand what that means in terms of data ethics? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, so data ethics is really just, to explain it in a nutshell, it's our ethical and moral obligations around our use of data. But within our function specifically, we are very much aligned to the technology side of things, as you kind of alluded to. So our role as a team is to assess any new data-driven technology that Police Scotland wants to use, and we have established our own framework and triage process in order to do that, which has been up and running since 2021, and we've obviously continued to refine that over the past few years, and we've got to quite a mature state with that. So I suppose our framework really sets out what good governance looks like in terms of data ethics, and how considering the data ethics implications enables informed decision making on an operational level.
That doesn't give me any examples. So that kind of sets out the framework, the triage, the process. But what if I was to say to you now, give me one example of data ethics that has worked, that has made a difference to the public safety of the people of Scotland, what would that be?
Okay, so I can tell you about a project that we're working on at the moment, and we're taking through our data ethics process. It'll probably help set the scene of exactly how our process works. So we have been looking at BriefCam, which is object recognition technology that's used on public space CCTV. It uses algorithms to identify objects within a frame, and the purpose around it is really just to cut down that manual review of hours and hours of CCTV footage. So, for example, in a high risk missing person situation where you need to locate someone as soon as possible, you can put in filters if you know what that person was last seen wearing. For example, if they were wearing a blue jacket and carrying a bag, you can add those filters, and BriefCam will then provide you with results of anyone matching that description that the human can then review and verify, and it just cuts down the time consuming process before it. So what we did with BriefCam is we took it through our data ethics triage process, and this is a triage that consists of 11 questions that we sit down with the project or the new data initiative, and we assess whether each of those 11 questions represents a high, medium or low risk in terms of data ethics. So we did that with BriefCam. We identified one high risk question, which was in terms of accuracy, and that was basically because we didn't have enough evidence about how accurate the algorithm was. So we obviously needed to do some work around that. What is something that's unique to Police Scotland is that we have what we call the rights-based pathway. So anything that's identified at the data ethics triage stage as having risks that we're not sure we're able to mitigate will then go through that rights-based pathway process for further scrutiny. So the rights-based pathway provides mechanisms for public engagement, stakeholder engagement, and further internal and external scrutiny as well, if required. So we've identified that potential risk around accuracy. What we then did was we did a public engagement survey on the BriefCam technology, received fairly positive responses to that, and then we took BriefCam to our internal scrutiny group, which is basically an oversight group that's made up of representatives across the organisation, and it's really just to bring in that wider perspective on something and how we can use new technology responsibly. So ultimately, because our role is to provide advice to whoever the senior decision maker is, the internal oversight group made some recommendations, and ultimately it was decided that BriefCam could move to a pilot phase whilst monitoring a few things about accuracy as we do that.
And there's quite an involved process you're going through there. So that's one supplier, one solution. Were you the first ones to ask them to go through this process in policing?
As far as I know, so while we were in the middle of that process, we did hear about other forces who were using the technology. So that worked really well, and we were able to share real live environment evidence of how accurate it was from them, and that informed our decision-making process. But obviously, we wouldn't follow all of those steps for every single project that comes to us. It's flexible and it's scalable according to the level of risk that's there, and how complex the ethical considerations are around something.
Are your concerns on the accuracy front around how it treats different people? We talked about the blue jacket, but are we talking about people's skin colour, about their age, about any other factors that are attributed to humans rather than what they're wearing? Is that your concern when it comes to accuracy?
Not particularly for that specific example that I gave, no, because while BriefCam is capable of doing facial recognition as well, we are not using that feature. It's disabled at a system level for us. So it is literally just picking out pixels and colours in an image and matching them, saying, I think this is this particular object and colour. It's not recognising actual people, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's helpful to know, because I wanted to talk to you. In fact, let's whiz forward to talk about facial recognition. I know that Police Scotland is not using facial recognition software at the moment, unlike many forces in England, which are increasingly starting to use it. We had your Chief Technology Officer, Andrew Hendry, came to the show last year and spoke to us about the beginning of the process of looking at facial recognition and consulting the people in Scotland. I wonder if you could just give us a little background on what you were doing to consider facial recognition and where you are in terms of the process.
Yeah, so I think actually what we've done with live facial recognition is a good example of how our work with data ethics so far has really embedded ethics at the forefront of our thinking in terms of our organisational culture. So the approach that we've taken with live facial recognition, and this is before we've even got to the data ethics triage stage of assessing a specific piece of technology, is that we have started a public conversation around the potential use of live facial recognition in Scotland. So how we started that was we launched a public survey just to kind of gather general views on what people think about the use of this technology in public spaces and what kind of use cases might be acceptable. We also ran various focus groups with specific groups from different areas, and we are basically using all of that information early on to help us decide whether we would actually want to use the technology or not. So that is before any kind of decision is made or any supplier is identified. And we've obviously been leaning on a lot of the good practice from the College of Policing, the NPCC, and our colleagues in the Metropolitan Police in South Wales as well, kind of finding out how they've approached this and what it might look like should we choose to adopt the technology as well. But it's very much public engagement first, transparency first, and we'll go from there depending on what opinions we get back, what different views are revealed through that process.
It's interesting that you're doing that in Scotland, because I'm not sure that we really saw that in England, and particularly the more recent forces who are adopting it because of the Home Office money that came in. I don't know whether they're going through that process as well. Is there a particular reason why Scotland's treating it in such a different way? Do you think it's embedded because of the way that you treat ethics and this whole process that you've been through, the level of your maturity that you are taking this approach? Is that what's the reason going forward in this way?
I absolutely think so, yeah. So we're obviously quite mature in terms of data ethics compared to several other organisations, not even just in policing, I would say. And I think that a lot of that has come from our leadership team, who've been hugely supportive of data ethics and our rights-based pathway process. They speak about it publicly a lot. So it really has come from the top down. And so we already had the process set up and established, and we'd already put public engagement and stakeholder engagement considerations at the forefront of the agenda. So I think it was just a natural step to realising that for live facial recognition that's going to impact a huge number of the public potentially, depending on where it's deployed, that we need to do something a bit extra on top of that in terms of transparency.
Okay. And in terms of the authorised professional practice that's sitting underneath a lot of police activity, specifically with your area around data ethics, does that give you a foundation in which to work? And have you contributed to that foundation, or do you use it? Where did that happen first? Did you get there first? Can you give us a sense of how those two things come together?
Yeah, I take it you're referring to the College of Police and APP. Yeah.
I am, yes. So yes, the APPP and around data ethics. I was just wondering whether, given the maturity that you've spoken about, whether you informed it or it informed you. Just wondering which way around it was.
Our data ethics framework was already in place before that professional practice was published, and we contributed to the development of the principles that are within that, along with other forces in the UK. But because we already had our framework quite well established and it's working for us, we're just obviously, we're aware of what the APP says, and it does actually align with our principles as well that we've already established and the processes that we follow. So it's always good to know that we're moving towards a national common viewpoint on these things.
And in that practice, it talks about the operating with fairness and impartiality. I wonder if you could help me understand what that means in a policing context when you're thinking about data ethics. How can one be fair and impartial when thinking about, the example there, the brief cam example is an interesting one. You've got a piece of software, you think this might do the job, this might help solve a problem, but you need to make sure that it's fair and impartial in terms of the outcome. So how do you embed it into people's thinking when they're thinking about making those software decisions?
Fairness forms quite a big part of our triage process that we follow, actually. So as I said earlier, we have 11 questions that we ask as part of that, and 3 of them cover what the underlying data will be that's required. And we also have question 11 asks about whether there's the potential that certain groups of people might be affected more than others. So those questions are really there to tease out any potential for things like bias or issues with fairness in the actual data set itself, for example, or with an AI model in terms of the output. Fairness is obviously something that often comes up in the context of facial recognition bias quite a lot. So I think that we've learned a lot from the early deployments of that technology, most definitely. The technology itself, I think, has improved as developers have started to build fairness into the training of their data sets as well, and understanding that this is a huge issue. But I would say that it's still a priority to assess fairness for the specific model that you're using, and that's the approach that we take. There can be a lot of noise about data ethics, and a lot of it is based on historical issues with certain types of technology, and part of our role is to really focus on the specific tool that we're using. How accurate is that? Are there any issues with fairness? Is it going to potentially disadvantage particular groups of people, for example? And one of the things that we also introduced as part of our framework is a post-implementation review, which I think helps to make sure we're acting with fairness as well, because that is really there to assess whether there's been any unintended consequences of the use of a tool following actual use of it in a live environment, recognizing that things can potentially change over time, and there might actually be things that you maybe didn't predict at the very beginning when you were first assessing it. So we do have that as well as a kind of a backup. We'll maybe go back a year or so down the line after something's been introduced and do that.
Can you give us an example of what you mean by that?
So it's not a full data ethics triage again, but I'll just pluck an example out of the air. Something like national body-worn video, for example. So that is a piece of technology that's processing biometric data that we would have assessed at the time it was first considering being deployed. And now in Police Scotland, we have actually rolled it out to all divisions. So if we were looking to review body-worn video, we would go back now that it's been fully deployed and just ask the questions of the relevant business area as to how it's being used. Have there been any issues identified that we maybe didn't anticipate at the beginning? And things like that.
You're quite late to the party of body-worn video in Scotland, one of the last forces to adopt it.
We are, yes.
What was the thought process on the ethics point of view of introducing that? Did you go through this entire process that you've described already around this framework, this triaging? Has it been through all of that? Is that all publicly available for people to see what your thought process was?
It has been through the process. It's not publicly available because not much of our work is so far when it's specific to different projects like that. But you have touched on something that we do want to prioritise for the future, because I think there's a big move across policing in general and with other organisations as well, that we've recognised that we should be being as transparent as possible. I think for us it was more important to get our process up and running and working effectively. And now that we are kind of in that mature state, we will look to publish more things like that potentially in the future, or at least have details of things that we're using, like a lot of organisations have, like an AI register, for example.
Yeah, so you've mentioned AI a couple of times, and I find in these conversations it always pops up. It's inevitable. So data ethics is at the heart of artificial intelligence. So I just wonder what kind of conversations you're having about the push for organisations to use AI in lots of different ways. What is Police Scotland's view on AI at the moment? And what is the role of your area in terms of making sure that conversation happens in a way that results in the fairness, impartiality that we talked about just now?
I think that the live facial recognition national conversation that I mentioned is probably the most high profile example of AI that we're thinking about using. But I would say, to be honest, Police Scotland is still quite early in our journey with AI specifically, but our data ethics framework was definitely designed with AI in mind. As I said at the beginning, we do have a data science team as well who are kind of looking at prototypes at the moment, and they're going to be introducing AI capabilities in the future. So I think it's reassuring to us to know that we have that well-established triage process and the end-to-end process as well. And everything will just go through that, and will provide whoever the senior responsible owner is with informed decision-making, basically. When it comes to AI, though, we've actually realised recently that there is a need to go even further than what we've already done and kind of fill in the gaps for AI specifically. And by that, I mean, so we have our step-by-step process. We do a lot of assessment at the very beginning, at the onset of a new project, and then we have that post-implementation review, but that only happens once. When it comes to things like AI, I think we've recognised that there's a need for overall accountability and ownership throughout the entire life cycle of using that tool. Who's responsible for monitoring any potential risks with it? Who's the overall owner? And those are the kind of gaps that we need to fill. So we have actually started looking at the wider AI governance for our organisation at the moment.
That's interesting thinking about it, the life cycle, isn't it? That often you think you kind of AI is moving along quite fast, that the developments you read about in the press, and then you decide to make your jump at this point, adopt this AI. You think kind of that just sits still. But unfortunately, all those people who are involved might move on, and they might be different. And so what you're saying is that it's almost like it has an ownership that evolves with it over time. So you're checking in with it. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's really just building on what we already have to make sure that everyone that's involved in designing, testing and actually using AI understands that they have a responsibility as well. It's a wider organizational responsibility, because I think with AI, we recognize that regardless of how much assessment you do at the beginning and how comfortable you are with it, things can change over time. An AI model could just become less effective over time, for example, as can be as simple as that. And also there's a potential for we become more familiar with an AI tool. People might become complacent over time. So it's things like that really, I think, require monitoring for anything that could potentially go wrong through actual use of it.
And are you keeping an eye on what's happening in England with Alex Murray taking up this new role as the police AI guru? He told me recently that they'd be given £111 million to invest in police AI, which doesn't seem like a lot of money to me when it comes to this stuff. Are you keeping a close eye on what they're doing? Are you linked in with that work?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's, as demonstrated with live facial recognition, I think it's always easier when there's other police forces that you can share best practice with and just share each other's experiences. If we started developing specific tools that could then be used by other police forces across the country, then that makes our job a lot easier, because it's something that's already been assessed. I'm not saying we wouldn't assess it ourselves, obviously, but it's having a national unit like that is a potential route to get really good kind of external oversight as well, and reliable testing of something that we can then use. I think
you're right. I think you've hit on something there in terms of try it once and let other people then use it. But if you don't trust the testing, you're just going to do it again. So there's really much that relationship, I imagine, being built up over time. So we've got Alex Murray doing that role in the police AI area. We've also got Kate Fisher-Stevens. So she's heading up the National Data Analytics Office. Again, Home Office, England-based. What's your relationship like with that national function?
We shared our data ethics framework with the NPCC previously to help establish national best practice in terms of data ethics. So we have collaborated with them quite a bit and will continue to do so. I'm actually part of an academic research study that's going on at the moment, which the NPCC collaborated with to produce their responsible AI checklist. So I sit on the advisory board for that, and it's producing a lot of kind of usable outcomes for policing in the UK that we can all kind of get to a standardized point, hopefully, on a national level. I also actually sit on a data ethics group that we've established just with the few of us that are data ethics lead in our respective forces, so that we can kind of regularly meet up and share things that we've worked on together as well, and just discuss data ethics issues in policing more generally. It's really good to have that group there.
Yeah, I think it's great to have a community, and it does make me think about this idea of it being a profession. So is there a data profession in policing that you're part of, in the same way that if I was a librarian, I might be a member of the Association of Librarians? I mean, is there an equivalent of that for the kind of work that you're doing for that community, but also a recognition of professionalism, about accreditation, CPD, all of that sort of things? How does that work for you?
There's nothing specific to policing yet. However, I'm accredited by the Open Data Institute. So I completed the data ethics professional course, which was a really good foundation of training. And that does give you a certification as a data ethics professional. So I think a few of us in policing are going to be going on that course as well.
Okay. It's good to hear you talking about the ODI. I wonder also whether you're working with colleagues in fire, ambulance, the wider part of the emergency services, local resilience forums. Are there equivalents of you elsewhere, and you will have the same issues that you talk about?
It's not a kind of sector that I've specifically come across yet, but we do, as part of our kind of general rights-based pathway stakeholder engagement, we would potentially engage with anyone depending on the context of what we were looking at. So a kind of the typical organisations that we would engage with through that is we keep in touch with the Scottish Police Authority, who are our oversight body, the Scottish Government, the Biometrics Commissioner, and we might also need to engage with the Information Commissioner as well. So we do engage with a lot of different areas through that, but as I said, it is very context specific. So it would only be if there was something that was impacting multi-emergency services that we would take that route.
Yes, and I think sometimes it's good to have a community, even if you're in different parts of the blue light world. So I'm sure there are others who are doing similar things. So hopefully they'll be listening to this, and then they'll be in touch with you to be part of your community, which I think would be really helpful. So that talks about the profession, but in terms of the leaders, you talked about leadership earlier and the leadership to set up your area years ago. I wonder now, how do we get leaders in police forces generally to think about this as a topic? What sort of advice you might have for others listening about how you get it onto the table of the boardroom effectively when there are so many other priorities? So how do you encourage that kind of discussion when there are so many other competing priorities?
I think for us, it was almost just part of really good timing, for one, and being able to demonstrate quite early on some successes in terms of data ethics enabling some technology that we were previously maybe a bit reluctant to use because we were coming from quite a risk-averse position. Our chief constable, for example, has always been very pro-digital and data innovation, and she's a big advocate of our processes and the rights-based pathway as well. And I think just generally over the past few years, leadership in Police Scotland has really come to understand the value of data. So the joint strategy for policing that we set out in 2020, we set out an ambition in that to become an organisation driven by effective and efficient use of data in an ethical way. So the two were, ethics and data, were almost talked about in tandem from the very beginning. And I think as well, at the time that our function was introduced, we were just coming out of quite a negative place. So Police Scotland came under a lot of heavy media and regulator scrutiny because of the way that we introduced our cyber kiosk devices a few years ago. And this actually led to the Scottish Government establishing an independent advisory group on emerging technologies in policing. So although that started off from a very negative point, it was a really good kind of stepping stone for us to show, okay, so we've learned from our mistakes. Basically, we weren't transparent enough about how we introduced these cyber kiosk devices. What can we learn from that and what can we build on? And so I think that really gave us the edge to kind of change the culture and put data ethics on a priority with our leadership because of that.
Interesting. So the 2020, the changes was actually the result of a problem. I hadn't appreciated that. So talk to me about cyber kiosks, and I'm not sure that people listening will necessarily know what you're talking about. Could you just tell me what the problem, what were they? What were they trying to do, and what was the problem it was causing?
Cyber kiosks are a digital forensics analysis device, which basically triages someone's mobile phone, for example, and it basically allows you to filter the data that you need from that, the data that's going to be of evidential value. But I think that the main issue around them, it wasn't around the technology itself. It was because we hadn't done the adequate kind of governance around them before we introduced them, because obviously data ethics, we didn't have data ethics back then. It didn't exist. And it was really more that we introduced those and nobody knew about it. We hadn't done the level of engagement that we definitely would do now. So I think that was the main part of the controversy around that. And that's how we kind of overcame it, by establishing this really robust process that we have now.
Interesting. So you try something new, it doesn't work out, it becomes a problem. I'm not sure whether it was a legal case or whatever it was, something happened. And then you kind of go, okay, we need to start again. And that's 6 years ago now. So you've learned an awful lot in that period, and you're in quite a strong position now. So if we look to the future, as we sort of start to draw our conversation to a close, where does data ethics go next? You've given us a sense of where it's come from, the kind of things you're going now. You gave us that brief CAM example, which was interesting. We talked a bit about facial recognition. But in the next few years, where do you see the threats and opportunities for the work that you're doing?
I think that it's actually quite surprising how quickly data ethics has become absolutely intrinsic to any conversations that we have about innovation, particularly in policing, but for a wide range of organizations. It's now a complete priority. And even just a handful of years ago, probably a lot of people had never even heard of it. So I think that really shows the impact that it's had. And I think that it can only grow from now, to be honest. I think that there is now, as I mentioned, we're talking about our wider AI governance piece. I think there's now scope to kind of build that in more. I think a lot of organizations are starting to recognize that when we deal with things like AI, it's a long-term organizational responsibility rather than just a one-off assessment at the beginning. And I think that another big part of what we're going to be doing in the future, particularly in policing, is that there is a big push for greater transparency now. I mean, you may have seen the good practice that the Metropolitan Police and South Wales have around their use of live facial recognition, publishing details of deployments, impact assessments, and testing of the actual AI model. And I think that we'll all start moving in that direction from now on. And in the future, you'll probably see a lot more public information around this, which is something that policing has never had before in terms of conventional policing. We would never publish anything like this. So I think it can only be a good thing as we move towards this.
Yes, I think to be transparent is definitely it should be the standard for policing, and to show everybody, because the public service, publicly funded, and people want to know what you're doing. Might not always understand it, they might not always be interested in, but the fact that they can see it. I dig around and look for the deployment information for facial recognition, and I do find it, and it is good to know it. So I think this is all going in the right direction. It's interesting, just one thing I pick you up on there in terms of, you talked about it being a long-term organisational responsibility, which suggests that it's everybody's responsibility in your organisation, regardless of where they sit. My last question to you is, how do you make sure that people do think data ethics first in their work?
I think it's part of an overall kind of data literacy culture and AI literacy culture as well. I think it's the end users that really need to understand what a specific piece of technology is giving you in terms of the output and how you then interpret that. I don't think it's enough anymore to simply say, like, oh, we've got a human in the loop. I think that as we learn more about these kind of technologies now and what the potential risks are, including the potential for the human in the loop to become complacent over time. I think we need to establish a wider process around that. And the effectiveness of the human in the loop is not the be all and end all. It's the process that's followed around that. How do we get from that AI output, for example, to making a decision? What's the process that's followed, and what points do we need human intervention at throughout that entire process? Where's the potential for things to go wrong?
Interesting that you talk about human in the loop. That was one of my questions. I skipped past it because I kind of thought we touched on it, but you're absolutely right that if we put the human in the loop, we need to make sure that human is trained, knows the impacts, understands what they're doing, and that actually you need to do that over time. It's not a one-off, do a training course, job done. So I'm pleased to hear you talk in those terms. That's been absolutely fascinating, Corinne, to go through all of those different elements of data ethics. And it's very clear to me that this process, the stages, is very important to you and your work. And it's the thing that creates the foundation to achieve the fairness and impartiality we talked about earlier. So it just leaves me to say thank you so much for taking time to talk to me today.
Thank you very much.
So, do you feel like you know more about data ethics having listened to this? It feels like a niche conversation, and I worry about how to make a topic like data ethics widely known and understood. I'm pleased you talked about data literacy, as this will help build people's skills and ethics as well as all the other elements of using data in large organisations like Police Scotland. The cyber kiosk experience is telling. It shouldn't take a crisis to reimagine the way that technology is introduced and governed, and yet it often does. But it did mean that Police Scotland upped its game, invested in people like Corinne to bring the rigour and process that she eloquently describes here, and today the organisation is streets ahead in terms of its data maturity. Which means they have strong foundations for adopting AI. It's reassuring to know we have the process and everything will go through that, she says. It's clear they are cautious, but with Chief Constable Joe Farrell in charge, the required leadership is there. Joe previously headed up the digital programme for the National Police Chiefs Council. Clearly there's work to be done, with Corinne suggesting more openness by sharing their process with the public. More collaboration with the other emergency services would also be beneficial. There is lots of work going on in the National Fire Chiefs Council, for example. Conversations about ethics are intrinsic to conversations about innovation, she concludes. And for technology, that's a good place to start. My thanks to Corinne for talking to me. That's it from me for now. Episodes of this series drop every Tuesday. This series is brought to you in partnership with the Emergency Tech Show and the Police Digital Service. The show takes place on 16th, 17th of September at the NEC in Birmingham. Registration is now open and the link is in the show notes. If you're interested in finding out more about police use of AI, do check out the episode of this series where I talked to Police AI lead Al Murray. Be sure to like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to For Every Response, the podcast from Emergency Services Times.